So in today's video, I just wanted to cover some basic tips for bookkeeping for business owners. I find this is really important, and this is something I do for myself in my business. So just came up with some ideas that I think can be helpful for small business owners. And before I start the video, I just want to say that the right method for bookkeeping can vary a lot depending on the business, the nature of the business, the preferences of the owner, things like that. So this is just very general information and tips that I find work well for me and some of my clients. So tip number one is do your bookkeeping by category, especially for expenses. Now, again, this might not make the most sense in some types of businesses, but in a lot of types of businesses, it does. And what I mean by that is categorize your expenses by category. So for example, have like a category for advertising, for office supplies, for rent, for insurance, for bank fees, and kind of separate those. And what you can do with those is align them in order so that they correspond with your tax return. So on a tax return form for a business activity, it'll have the different expense categories like advertising, insurance, interest, rent, things like that. So if you line it up in the same way on your bookkeeping spreadsheet, then it'll be easy to input when you're doing your taxes. The next tip is have rows on a spreadsheet, assuming you're using a spreadsheet, for 12 months for items that you pay once per month. So for example, if you have a cell phone for your business and you're paying once per month, or you're paying monthly rent, when you create that category, that section on your spreadsheet, have 12 rows. That way you can double check it easily to make sure that you've input the expense for every month. Because in that case, if you're just adding a row every time you input the expense, it's a little bit easier to miss it or not catch it when you're reviewing at the end of the year. So if you just start with 12 rows, you'll know at the end of the year that if it's not full, then you forgot to input one of those expenses for one of the months. The next tip is make sure you are recording your sales tax properly. Now, of course, this depends what region you're in, what sales tax you're collecting. This might vary depending on your goods and services that you sell. So the important thing is to break that out if you need to. In the case of GST in Canada, if you are collecting GST on your sales, then you want to claim the GST on your expenses as GST input tax credits, and therefore break that out of your expenses and not claim that as part of your regular expenses when you're filing your taxes. Whereas when it comes to provincial sales taxes, you might want to break that out as well, but typically you don't have input tax credits for provincial sales taxes the same way you do with GST. So in that case, it is more important to break it out on your revenue and less important to break it out on your expenses. And typically with your expenses, you'll just want to clump that in with your regular business expenses when you file those for your income tax. Whereas again, with the GST, you're claiming those separately as input tax credits. The next tip for bookkeeping is to claim your expenses when you incurred them and your revenue when you actually earned it. So this comes down to accrual-based accounting versus cash-based accounting. And in some industries, you can do cash-based accounting. And if you want to find out more about these different types of accounting, I did previously make a video on this, and I will leave a link to that in the video description below. But for most industries, you're required to do accrual accounting, which basically means you should be claiming expenses, not when you paid for them, but when you actually incurred that cost and actually got the benefit from that expense. And then with revenue, likewise, you don't claim the revenue when you got the money, it's when you actually, did the work to earn that revenue. So it's important to get that right because that really can change how your taxes look and it can affect your bookkeeping. And again, some businesses can do the cash-based accounting, so I would recommend looking into that just to make sure you're using the right method for your industry and for your jurisdiction. And now my last tip is just to have check figures. You could have a column with all your revenue from every month, and then you could break that down quarterly and then just check to make sure that your quarter sum is equal to, the 3 months from that quarter. And then at the very bottom, you could have the sum of all your revenue throughout the year. And then you could just add up the 4 quarters on the side to make sure that those numbers all align, just to make sure that you're not making any mistakes or missing any cells in the spreadsheet or something like that. Same thing with expenses. Just make sure that if you're using a spreadsheet, that you are capturing the right cells and all of the cells that you need to make sure you're getting everything that should be included in those different expenses for different categories. And then one last thing, just to wrap up, make sure you're claiming all the expenses you can for your business. And I do have other videos on that, but there are a lot of expenses that you can claim, and I find some business owners just aren't aware of those different business expenses. So it's good to familiarize yourself with those different business expenses you can claim on your taxes. So hopefully this video is useful. If so, please click like, and feel free to check out my YouTube channel here, where I have over 250 videos that cover business management and business startup topics.